Ethan Cole had always believed that maps could tell stories more honestly than people ever could, and perhaps that was why he had devoted his quiet, solitary life to the art of cartography. While others might have looked at land as a commodity to be bought, sold, or reshaped according to need, Ethan saw in every contour line and in every bend of a road a trace of memory and intention, something permanent that deserved respect. When he inherited the secluded property on the hill, with its winding driveway cutting through a sloping patch of oak and cedar, it felt less like acquiring real estate and more like being entrusted with a relic. The road that led to his house was narrow, uneven, and at times so serpentine it seemed to double back on itself. But Ethan cherished those imperfections, for to him the driveway was not merely an entryway to the home, but the spine of the land. Itself, a geographical signature that set it apart, Eddie. His house stood at the crest of the incline, a two-story building that blended modern glass with weathered wood, built by the previous owner who had cared more about views of the valley than about curb appeal. To Ethan, this arrangement was perfect, because he had never been one to seek admiration from neighbors or passers-by. His work, painstaking and meticulous, happened indoors or behind the wheel of his old Jeep, when he drove for hours across forgotten backroads to update private maps commissioned by surveyors, developers, or universities. He had chosen this property precisely because it lay outside the suffocating reach of the local homeowners association, whose reputation for enforcing absurd restrictions had already become the subject of complaints from more than one colleague of his who lived in the area. For Ethan, independence was not a luxury but a necessity, and every curve of his private driveway symbolized that autonomy. When he moved in, he had stood at the bottom of the hill one evening, staring up at the way the road coiled toward his home, and had imagined how easily it could be mistaken for a miniature racetrack. The thought had amused him but remained no more than a passing observation, the sort of whimsical note a cartographer might jot in the margins of a draft. He did not crave excitement, nor did he wish to turn his home into anything more than a sanctuary. Yet that road held a quiet magnetism, as though it were waiting for something unexpected to happen upon it. His neighbors rarely came by, partly because the steep ascent discouraged casual visits, and partly because Ethan himself had cultivated an air of distance, not unfriendly, but reserved, as though he preferred to be approached only when necessary. He had no spouse, no children, and no relatives nearby. His world was defined by the paper he worked on, the screens he analyzed, and the road that wound upward to the house he called his refuge. The first months passed in a rhythm that suited him. Mornings spent cataloging maps in his study, afternoons spent walking the property with a notebook in hand, sketching trees and elevations the way other men might sketch portraits. He repaired the old fencing along the edge of his lot, cleared brush from the drainage ditch by the lower bend of the driveway, and occasionally waved to the delivery drivers who cursed under their breath about the awkward incline, but always admitted it was a beautiful spot once they reached the top. Ethan did not care about their opinions, but he filed away every detail they mentioned, because observation was second nature to him. He noticed which weeks the HOA crews worked along the main boulevard below, trimming hedges and repainting curbs, and he took particular satisfaction in knowing that their authority stopped at the bottom of his hill. To Ethan, his driveway was more than asphalt and gravel. It was proof of boundary. That winding path drew the line between him and a world that seemed obsessed with interference, rules, and conformity. Whenever he looked at it, he felt a reassurance that his independence was intact. What he did not yet know was that this same path, cherished for its solitude and its irregular beauty, would soon become the focal point of a struggle that would force him out of anonymity and into conflict with people who believed that no private boundary could withstand their collective will. For now, though, Ethan remained unaware of the storm approaching, and on quiet evenings he would sit by the upstairs window, watching the last light fall across the bends of the driveway, feeling certain that as long as that road remained his alone, nothing could disturb the order he had so carefully constructed. Ethan returned from a 3-day trip to the northern counties, where he had been working on a commissioned map of abandoned mining routes, and he felt the usual calm anticipation of reaching his property after time away. The drive home was long, and the closer he came to the familiar turnoff that led toward his hill, the more he craved the silence of his house and the steady reassurance of the winding road that welcomed him like a ribbon, guiding him back into solitude. He turned onto the entrance lane, expecting to see the familiar uneven surface of his driveway, the scattered gravel, the weathered edges that he knew almost by heart. But as soon as his headlights swept across the incline, his hands froze on the steering wheel. The road was no longer his road. It gleamed, dark and oily, like a new scar across the land. Instead of the fractured, patchy surface he had preserved, the entire driveway had been paved with fresh asphalt, perfectly smooth, its edges neatly framed by concrete curbs that had never existed before. Painted in bright, reflective white was a double line dividing the lane in two, and near the bottom, where the hill began, a small rectangular sign had been planted in the soil. Residential Access Road, maintained by Lakeside HOA. For a moment, Ethan thought he had turned down the wrong entrance, some parallel drive that led into one of the newer developments lower in the valley, but as he climbed slowly upward, disbelief tightening his chest, he recognized the trees, the bends, the very slope that had been etched into his memory for months. It was his land, his driveway, but it had been transformed overnight into something alien. When he stepped out of his Jeep at the crest, the chemical tang of fresh tar stung his nose, proof that the work had been completed only a day or two earlier. He crouched to touch the surface, still faintly tacky beneath the cool night air. In the distance, the valley lights shimmered, but Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the line of paint running up his driveway, a line that felt like an incision through his autonomy. There had been no warning, no request for permission, not even a notice left in his mailbox. His property had been altered in his absence, not by vandals or pranksters, but by an organization that had no rightful claim over it. The next morning, he drove down to the bottom of the hill to examine the sign more closely. It bore the official HOA emblem, a stylized oak tree inside a circle, and beneath the bold letters was a smaller plaque with the words Community Improvement Initiative, 2024. The arrogance of it staggered him. This was no accident, no mistake by a misguided road crew. This was an intentional declaration that the road now belonged to them, that his carefully drawn boundary had been erased and replaced with their authority. Ethan marched to the HOA office that afternoon, a squat brick building squeezed between a pharmacy and a bank in the commercial strip below. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and printer toner, and behind the reception desk a woman with perfectly arranged hair greeted him with the hollow courtesy of someone trained to deflect confrontation. When he demanded to see whoever was responsible for the road work, she disappeared briefly and returned with Victoria Lane, the HOA president. Victoria carried herself with a mixture of elegance and severity, dressed in a pale suit that seemed designed to project authority rather than warmth. She ushered Ethan into a small conference room, where a single folder lay neatly arranged on the table as though waiting for him. When Ethan asked why his driveway had been paved without his consent, Victoria smiled with the composure of someone who had prepared her lines in advance. She explained that the HOA had received multiple complaints about the lack of safe access up the hill, that emergency vehicles might struggle with the old surface, and that the board had voted unanimously to include his road in a shared access upgrade project to benefit the growing number of residents in the area. Ethan cut her off, insisting that his property was private, that he had deliberately purchased it outside of HOA jurisdiction. Victoria tilted her head, her smile sharpening as she slid the folder across the table. Inside was a printed map from the county database, showing his lot bisected by a shaded corridor labeled Community Easement. Ethan studied it with mounting disbelief. The line drawn across his land was new, an artificial addition that had never existed in the original records. He knew this because he had examined every plat and survey before closing on the property, and nowhere had there been mention of an easement. Yet here it was, a digital document printed and stamped, declaring that the driveway was now considered a shared thoroughfare. When he demanded to know how this could be possible, Victoria shrugged lightly and replied that the bylaws had been updated, that the community had to adapt, and that his refusal to recognize collective needs would not change the legal reality. Her words rang in his head long after he left the office. Legal reality. It was a phrase that twisted the meaning of law into something malleable, shaped not by truth or precedent, but by the will of those who controlled access to the records. As he drove back up the newly paved road, the tires of his Jeep whispering against the unfamiliar smoothness, he felt as though he were trespassing on his own land. Each bend of the driveway, once comforting in its rough irregularity, now seemed hostile, a reminder that someone had decided his boundaries were meaningless. That night, Ethan spread out the old paper surveys across his dining table, tracing the inked lines with his finger, comparing them to the memory of the printed map Victoria had shown him. The discrepancy was blatant. His land had never contained a shared corridor, yet the county database now reflected otherwise. He realized, with a clarity that tightened his chest, that this was not simply a matter of misunderstanding or overreach. Someone had tampered with official records, inserted an easement that stripped him of control, and done so with enough confidence to pour asphalt across his driveway as if daring him to resist. The catalyst of his struggle had arrived not with threats or violence, but with the quiet, calculated theft of a line on a map, and for a cartographer like Ethan, that was the most intimate violation imaginable. He stared out the window toward the road, the pale reflection of the painted lines catching the moonlight, and he understood that the conflict ahead would not be about asphalt or convenience. It would be about whether truth could survive against the machinery of manipulation, and whether a solitary man could defend the shape of his world against those determined to redraw it. The following days were consumed by restless tension that left Ethan unable to focus on his usual work. Every time he tried to sit at his drafting desk or open the topographic software on his laptop, his mind circled back to the image of that freshly paved road and the smug composure of Victoria Lane. The violation of his land had not been a mistake. It was a statement, and the folder she had placed in front of him had been less an explanation than a weapon. He could not stop thinking about the line drawn across the map, an artificial boundary pretending to be legitimate, and it gnawed at him because he knew better than anyone how much weight people gave to lines once they were printed and stamped. In his field, a single adjustment on a survey could shift the fate of entire parcels, influencing ownership battles, tax disputes, or development plans. To fabricate such a line was not merely unethical. It was the rewriting of truth, and now that rewriting was being used against him. Ethan decided he had to confront the board directly rather than letting Victoria dictate the narrative. The HOA held its meetings every Thursday evening in the community hall, a place he had never set foot in since moving to the area, preferring always to remain invisible to the bureaucracy below his hill. When he arrived, the room was already buzzing with small clusters of residents, their conversations rising in a steady murmur. The walls were decorated with posters extolling neighborhood pride and shared responsibility, slogans that struck him as hollow in light of what had been done. He took a seat near the front, drawing several curious glances from people who recognized him vaguely as the man on the hill. When the meeting began, Victoria presided with the poise of a seasoned politician, moving briskly through the agenda of landscaping contracts and parking regulations before Ethan raised his hand and asked to speak. There was a moment of hesitation, a ripple of whispers, and then she allowed it with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Ethan stood and explained as calmly as he could that his driveway was private property, that he had never consented to the paving project, and that he had proof in the form of original surveys showing no easement. He demanded to know on what authority the board had acted and why his rights as an owner had been ignored. The reaction was a mix of discomfort and irritation. A few residents looked sympathetic, but most avoided his gaze, unwilling to challenge the authority that had become habitual in their lives. Victoria responded smoothly, reminding everyone that safety and access were community priorities, and implying that Ethan's objections came from selfishness rather than fact. She produced again the printed map with the shaded corridor, holding it aloft as if it were unassailable proof, and declared that all actions had been carried out within the bounds of regulation. Her words were met with nods from several board members, who seemed less convinced by the evidence than by the authority with which she presented it. Ethan pressed harder, pointing out that the easement was absent from older documents and demanding to know when the change had been entered into the county system. Victoria's smile tightened and she redirected the conversation, insisting that the details of record management were outside the board's responsibility, and that if Ethan wished to dispute it, he should take it up with the county clerk. It was a deft deflection, shifting the burden of proof onto him while reinforcing the appearance that the HOA had acted lawfully. By the time he sat down, his pulse hammering, he could feel the unspoken judgment of the room. He was the lone dissenter against a machine that thrived on conformity. The following week, Ethan began to feel the weight of subtle retaliation. A letter arrived in his mailbox citing him for supposed violations: improper fencing, unapproved vegetation, and failure to maintain drainage in a manner consistent with community standards. Each accusation was absurd. The fence was his, the plants grew naturally, the ditch was clear, but the intent was unmistakable. They were not trying to correct him. They were trying to bury him in distractions, to exhaust him with paperwork and fees until resistance seemed futile. He tore the letter in half, but knew more would come. Meanwhile, the presence of others on his road increased. Residents from the new development below began to drive up his driveway casually, treating it as if it were theirs by right. Some slowed to wave with polite obliviousness. Others sped through as though eager to claim their shortcut, but all of them were trespassing in his eyes. One afternoon, a landscaping truck rumbled up, its tires grinding into the fresh asphalt, and when Ethan confronted the driver, the man shrugged and said the HOA had given permission to use the road as access. Ethan could only stand there, fists clenched as the vehicle disappeared around the bend, the sound echoing against the trees like a taunt. The escalation reached its first sharp edge when Ethan returned from the store one evening to find a group of teenagers skateboarding down the smooth curves of his driveway, whooping with delight as they treated it like a recreational ramp. When he shouted at them to leave, they laughed and pointed to the sign at the bottom. "It's public now, old man." The words cut deeper than he expected, not because of the insult, but because of the conviction behind them. They believed it. The lie had already become truth in the minds of those who used the road, and once a lie is accepted collectively, disproving it becomes nearly impossible. That night, Ethan sat in his study surrounded by maps, the light of the desk lamp casting long shadows over the paper contours, and realized that he was up against more than an administrative error. This was a campaign, deliberate and strategic, aimed at erasing his ownership through repetition, paperwork, and social acceptance. He thought of Victoria's cool dismissal, the board's compliant silence, the letters piling in his mailbox, and the intrusions on his driveway. The battle lines were not drawn on the ground, but in perception, and perception was shifting swiftly against him. He could not allow that to continue, not when the very essence of his profession was about preserving accuracy against distortion. For Ethan, the first escalation had arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a creeping invasion that spread through signatures, notices, and footsteps on the asphalt. The driveway was no longer simply altered, it was being claimed piece by those who believed repetition of falsehood could overwrite reality. And as he sat in the glow of his lamp, tracing the honest lines of the old survey with trembling fingers, he knew the only way forward was to strike back, not with anger or violence, but with the precision of a cartographer who refused to let truth be redrawn by anyone else's hand. The weeks that followed were an exhausting blur of paper trails, unanswered calls, and silent battles fought in the space between Ethan's determination and the HOA's indifference. Each morning he checked his mailbox with a sense of dread, knowing he would find yet another letter stamped with the emblem of the oak tree, each one announcing new violations or escalating fines, all of which he ignored, but which nonetheless weighed on him like stones piling up on his chest. His driveway, once a private boundary, had become a thoroughfare buzzing with cars he did not recognize, the steady hum of engines replacing the silence that had been his refuge. Delivery vans, utility trucks, and even residents from 2 streets over began to cut through as if the road had been theirs all along, and every intrusion stoked his sense of helplessness. He could not post guards or chain off the entry without risking legal reprisals. The moment he placed so much as a cone at the bottom, a letter arrived within days warning of obstruction and legal liability. It was not enforcement of order, but the performance of dominance, and Ethan began to feel as though the walls of his sanctuary were tightening around him. Yet amid the suffocating pressure, a glimmer of strategy began to form. One evening, as he sat surrounded by the original surveys he had collected, his attention was caught by a folder that had lain unopened since the purchase of the property. A packet of correspondence between the previous owner and the county office, which had been included in the sale documents. Inside were letters from more than a decade earlier discussing improvements to the road and the county's refusal to classify it as public access due to its width, slope, and lack of conformity with state standards. The language was unambiguous. The driveway could never be certified for emergency use or incorporated into public thoroughfares without extensive reconstruction, something the prior owner had refused to consider. That refusal had preserved its status as private, and Ethan now realized that this record was a weapon, a piece of history that contradicted the manufactured narrative of the HOA. The discovery stirred in him a sense of cautious hope, but he knew paper alone would not win a battle fought as much in perception as in law. He needed witnesses, evidence beyond documents, something that could puncture the illusion that the HOA's claims were unassailable. For the first time since moving to the area, Ethan began to reach out to his neighbors, not with casual greetings or attempts at friendship, but with deliberate inquiries. He approached an elderly man who lived 2 houses down from the bottom of the hill, a man named Leonard who had been in the community long before Victoria Lane had risen to power. At first, Leonard was wary, unwilling to involve himself in disputes that had soured more than one resident's peace of mind. But when Ethan pressed gently, mentioning the paving project, Leonard's eyes narrowed with recognition. He recalled seeing the asphalt trucks rumbling up the hill at night under the cover of darkness, their work lights throwing long beams across the trees. He had thought it odd at the time that such work was being done without notice, but he had dismissed it as just another HOA contract. Ethan asked if he would be willing to confirm this account in writing, and after a pause, Leonard agreed, though reluctantly, warning Ethan that the HOA had ways of punishing those who spoke against it. Armed with both the old county correspondence and Leonard's statement, Ethan turned to the one place he had avoided, the county recorder's office. He requested the full history of his parcel, every plat, easement, and modification recorded in the system. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, printed a thick stack of documents and handed them over with little ceremony. But as Ethan sorted through them, his pulse quickened. The so-called easement that Victoria had brandished was dated less than 3 months earlier, entered as part of a routine update by a contracted surveyor whose name Ethan recognized from the small print on one of the HOA's project announcements. The connection was unmistakable. The HOA had not discovered a legitimate easement. They had created one by slipping it into the county system under the guise of maintenance. It was a forgery, dressed in bureaucratic clothing, and though subtle, it was vulnerable to exposure. That night, Ethan stayed awake long after midnight, assembling his findings into a coherent timeline. The old correspondence demonstrated that the county had explicitly denied the possibility of public classification. Leonard's statement placed the paving crews at work in secrecy, without community notice. The records revealed that the easement had been inserted months ago by a surveyor with ties to the HOA. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged, and for the first time Ethan felt that he had shifted from defense to offense. This was not merely his word against theirs. This was evidence of manipulation that could not easily be explained away. But the midpoint of his struggle did not bring relief. It brought escalation of another kind. The next morning, as he walked down to collect his mail, he found that the sign at the bottom of the hill had been replaced. The old plaque had been swapped out for a new one, larger, brighter, declaring in bold letters, "Community Racetrack Access, managed in partnership with Lakeside HOA." His breath caught as he stared at the words. They had not only stolen his driveway, they had co-opted his quiet observation that it resembled a racetrack, twisting it into branding for their narrative. It was as though they had reached into his private thoughts and weaponized them. Later that afternoon, he saw a family he did not recognize parking at the base of the road, unloading bicycles and riding up the incline as though it were a designated recreational path. The trespass was not hidden anymore. It was advertised. Ethan's first instinct was fury, a raw desire to tear the sign from the ground and hurl it into the woods, but he stopped himself. Anger would only feed their story that he was irrational, that he was the obstacle to progress. Instead, he began to consider a reversal. If they wanted to brand his driveway as a racetrack, perhaps he would let them. On his terms, not theirs. He imagined controlled access, barriers, an entry system that required payment. If they insisted it was shared, he would make it exclusive, and in doing so, he could shift the narrative once again. It was not simply about fighting them in court. It was about undermining their claim in practice, showing the community that the road was not theirs to use freely, but his to govern. The idea unsettled him because it required a kind of boldness he had avoided all his life. He was not a businessman or a showman. He was a mapmaker, a man who thrived in silence. Yet the violation had cornered him, and the only way out was to turn their own strategy back on them. He would take the label they had imposed and remake it. And in doing so, he would remind both them and himself that boundaries did not vanish simply because someone pretended they had. The midpoint of his struggle was not a victory but a turning point. The moment he decided that defense was no longer enough. If they wanted a racetrack, he would give them one. But it would be his racetrack, and every entry would carry a price that declared, unmistakably, whose land they had dared to claim. Ethan had never considered himself an entrepreneur, yet within 2 weeks of that decision the driveway had changed again, this time not through the quiet imposition of the HOA, but through his own deliberate hand. He hired a local contractor, not through flashy advertisements but by word of mouth, a man who specialized in custom gates and barriers for private estates, and together they installed an electronic gate at the bottom of the hill. It was sleek, black steel framed against the newly poured asphalt, and on its side, Ethan mounted a keypad that could accept access codes generated from an online system he set up with painstaking attention. He advertised discreetly, not in the neighborhood but through niche groups of hobbyists who appreciated small tracks for karting or cycling, and within days he had his first handful of paying visitors, each of whom entered only with a unique code that expired after their session. He set rules, times, and waivers, treating the road as a private circuit, and to his surprise, the system worked with efficiency. The irony was not lost on him. The HOA had forced him into public exposure, yet by leaning into their narrative of a racetrack, he had found a way to assert control. The first weekend of operation brought a surreal sight. A pair of young men unloaded go-karts from a trailer, their engines buzzing up the incline while Ethan stood at the crest, watching with arms folded. Later, a group of cyclists pedaled smoothly along the curves, treating the driveway as though it were a training loop. Their laughter and determination filled the air, but each one had paid to be there, and each one understood that the track belonged to Ethan Cole. To the neighbors who drove by and saw the activity, it was clear that the driveway was not community property, but a managed enterprise. Ethan did not care about profit, though the money trickling in was not insignificant, but about message. He had taken their trespass and monetized it, exposing the absurdity of the HOA's claim by turning it into something they could not co-opt without directly confronting him. But the response came swiftly. A week later, Ethan received a thick envelope, not from the HOA this time, but from the municipal zoning office, citing him for unlicensed commercial use of residential land. The complaint had been filed anonymously, but Ethan had no doubt who had orchestrated it. The language of the notice dripped with condescension. He was ordered to cease operations immediately, dismantle the gate, and submit to an inspection or face heavy fines. For hours he sat in his study staring at the letter, fighting the urge to crumple it and toss it into the fire. They were clever. By shifting the fight into zoning regulations, the HOA had found a new way to undermine him. He could already hear Victoria's voice in his mind, calm, triumphant, insisting that this was not personal but procedural. Ethan refused to yield. He dug through the county ordinances, poring over dense legal code until his eyes blurred, and found a clause buried deep in the text that allowed for temporary private events on residential property, provided that liability waivers were obtained and the participation was limited in scale. His operation, though branded as a racetrack, could fit neatly into that definition if framed correctly. He contacted a lawyer recommended by an acquaintance outside the neighborhood, a meticulous woman named Rachel Kim, who listened to his account and studied his evidence with a sharp intensity. She agreed that the HOA's actions smelled of collusion, and she assured him that the zoning complaint could be countered if they reframed his driveway events not as a business, but as a series of private gatherings with cost-sharing agreements. It was a subtle difference, but in legal terms it was enough to neutralize the accusation. As Rachel prepared her filings, the HOA escalated further. Cars began arriving late at night, headlights sweeping across Ethan's house before roaring down the driveway in reckless bursts, leaving behind tire marks and trash. The trespassers never used his gate. They came in groups, clearly emboldened by someone's encouragement, and though Ethan never caught them directly, he knew the tactic was meant to intimidate. One morning he found his gate plastered with stickers reading HOA Zone and Shared Access. He tore them down with shaking hands, but the unease lingered. The conflict was no longer confined to paperwork and meetings. It had spilled into the physical space of his life. Rachel advised him to document everything meticulously, and Ethan did, photographing each intrusion, saving every notice, building a dossier as carefully as he once built maps. Yet the weight of it pressed on him. He was an introvert, not a fighter, and the thought of standing in court or at a hearing made his stomach knot. But he also knew that retreat would mean the permanent loss of the boundary he had sworn to protect. When Rachel suggested they prepare a counterclaim, not only challenging the zoning violation but accusing the HOA of property interference and fraudulent record manipulation, Ethan hesitated for a long time before agreeing. It felt like a leap into a storm, yet he recognized that he was already inside it. The second escalation of the conflict was no longer a matter of letters or surveys. It had become a contest of endurance. The HOA sought to drown him in bureaucracy, to wear him down with relentless pressure until he surrendered. But for the first time in his life, Ethan realized he had something worth fighting beyond personal comfort. The driveway was not just asphalt or paint. It was a line on the map of his identity, and if he allowed it to be erased, then everything he believed in about truth and precision would be hollow. He looked out at the gate that night, the keypad glowing faintly in the dark, and felt the tension settle into something like resolve. They wanted him to falter, but he would not. The next move would be his, and when it came, it would strike at the very foundation of the story they had built. The courtroom was smaller than Ethan had imagined. Not the grand hall of justice depicted in films, but a modest chamber where fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the air carried the stale scent of paper and polish. Yet, despite its unassuming appearance, the room radiated the weight of consequence. On one side sat Ethan with Rachel at his side, their table stacked with carefully organized folders that represented months of research, sleepless nights, and the relentless fight to preserve a boundary that had once seemed unshakable. On the other side sat Victoria Lane with two board members and their counsel, a sharp-suited man who projected confidence with every glance at his notes. Behind them, several residents filled the benches, some out of curiosity, others perhaps to witness the downfall of the solitary man who had dared to challenge the collective. Ethan's pulse quickened as the judge entered, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, reminding himself that he was not simply defending pride, but truth itself. The proceedings began with the HOA's attorney, who spoke in measured tones about safety, access, and the alleged irresponsibility of one man refusing to acknowledge community needs. He displayed the printed map with the shaded easement, laying it on an easel as though it were incontrovertible fact, and argued that the paving had been both lawful and necessary. His words painted Ethan as selfish, obstructive, and reckless for turning a private driveway into what he described with disdain as an unlicensed racetrack. Each sentence was calculated to frame Ethan not as a property owner, but as a liability, someone whose actions endangered both the neighborhood and the sanctity of shared governance. When Rachel rose to respond, her calm was like steel wrapped in velvet. She began not with accusations but with context, laying out the history of the property, the county's previous refusal to classify the road as a public, and the suspiciously recent insertion of the easement. Piece by piece, she dismantled the image of inevitability the HOA had constructed, presenting Leonard's testimony about the nocturnal paving, then producing the correspondence Ethan had discovered in the sale documents. The judge leaned forward as she drew attention to the timestamp of the easement entry, pointing out that it had been logged by a surveyor who had worked on multiple HOA contracts in the past year. The implication of collusion hung heavily in the room, and Victoria's composed smile faltered just slightly, the first crack in her mask of authority. Then came the decisive moment. Rachel laid before the judge the original survey maps, yellowed with age yet indisputably authentic, their lines drawn by hand and signed by a county official long deceased. She compared them directly with the digital printout the HOA had submitted, highlighting the absence of any easement in the originals. She did not raise her voice or dramatize the revelation. She simply let the contrast speak for itself. Silence filled the chamber as the judge examined the documents, his brow furrowing. When Victoria's attorney tried to interject that bylaws had changed, Rachel countered swiftly that bylaws could not retroactively rewrite recorded property boundaries, and that to accept such a claim would be to render all titles meaningless. Her words carried a clarity that struck Ethan with a surge of gratitude, for she articulated what he had felt all along, that the truth of a line could not be erased simply because it was inconvenient to those who coveted it. Pressed by the judge, Victoria attempted to explain the community easement as a routine update, but in her haste she revealed too much. She admitted that the board had facilitated the process to expedite improvements, and though she quickly tried to reframe it, the admission landed with devastating weight. The judge's expression hardened, and the murmur from the benches confirmed that the residents had heard it too. For the first time, the authority of the HOA president appeared fragile, and the room seemed to tilt in Ethan's favor. When the ruling came, it was delivered with measured gravity. The court found that the HOA had acted beyond its authority, that the easement had been improperly entered, and that the paving of Ethan's driveway constituted unlawful interference with private property. The sale of access rights and the attempt to rebrand the road as community infrastructure were nullified. The HOA was ordered to compensate Ethan for damages, both material and emotional, and to cover legal costs. Most damningly, the matter of the forged easement was referred to the county prosecutor for further investigation. As the gavel struck, Ethan exhaled a breath he had not realized he had been holding. The tension in his chest released in a rush of relief, though beneath it lingered the exhaustion of months spent under siege. Around him, whispers rippled through the room, some residents casting uneasy glances at Victoria, others nodding faintly in recognition of the injustice revealed. Victoria herself sat stiffly, her composure shattered, her hands clenched white around the table's edge as though trying to hold on to a power that was already slipping from her grasp. For Ethan, the climax was not triumphal celebration, but a quiet restoration of balance. The road that had been stolen on paper had been returned in truth, not by force or spectacle, but by persistence and evidence. He left the courtroom not as a conqueror, but as a man who had reclaimed what was his, aware that the battle had cost him peace, but had preserved something far more valuable, the integrity of the line that defined his place in the world. When Ethan returned to his property after the ruling, the driveway stretched before him not as an open wound, but as a scar that had begun to heal, still bearing the unnatural smoothness of the asphalt, yet no longer claimed by anyone else's authority. The sign at the bottom of the hill had been removed under court order, leaving behind a patch of disturbed soil, and the silence of the road felt different now, less fragile, as though the land itself acknowledged his persistence. He walked slowly up the incline, each step measured, and allowed himself to imagine that the fight had imprinted something permanent not only on the ground, but on him as well. He was still the same man who preferred solitude to spectacle, who valued the honesty of maps over the noise of politics, yet he was no longer invisible. He had been forced into a conflict he never sought, had stood in a place where words rather than lines decided boundaries, and though it had drained him, it had also reshaped him in ways he could not ignore. In the weeks that followed, the community adjusted with a kind of uneasy silence. Victoria Lane resigned from her post, officially citing health reasons, though everyone knew the scandal had stripped her of influence. The HOA's letters ceased, the mailbox, once a daily reminder of intrusion, now holding only mundane bills and the occasional catalog. A few neighbors, perhaps emboldened by the trial, approached Ethan with tentative greetings, acknowledging quietly that they had always suspected the board went too far but had lacked the courage to speak. Ethan accepted their words politely but kept his distance, not out of bitterness but because he had learned that his strength lay not in belonging to their collective, but in maintaining his own boundary with dignity. He did not dismantle the gate at the bottom of the hill, though he no longer hosted cyclists or karting enthusiasts. Instead, he left the keypad in place, a silent marker of the period when his road had become a stage for defiance. Sometimes, when children from the nearby houses asked timidly if they could ride their bikes on the curves, he allowed it under his supervision, charging no fee but reminding them gently that the road was his and that they were guests. In those moments he found a strange comfort, as if he had taken the intrusion of the past and turned it into a controlled gesture of generosity. Ethan often sat by his window in the evenings looking down at the line of the driveway and thought about how fragile truth could be in the hands of those willing to manipulate it. The victory had not given him triumph, but perspective, a clearer sense of how easily boundaries could be redrawn and how necessary it was to guard them. He remained a cartographer, tracing lines on paper, yet he now understood that the most important line was not the one that curved across his land, but the one within himself, the refusal to let others define his reality. And as the light faded over the valley and shadows deepened along the bends of the road, he felt not the weight of solitude but the quiet assurance that he had preserved the shape of his world exactly as it was meant to be.